Hello everyone. Recently I played through the entirety of the Legend of Zelda Minish Cap, and in this video I just want to give my thoughts on it. I do want to point out that I'll be critical about some parts of this game, but yes, I do realize it's a nearly 20-year-old GBA game, so I'll try to keep that in mind. I will be discussing the story in this video, but again, it's a 20-year-old GBA game, so if you don't want to be spoiled, then come back after you've beaten it, but I really don't think you need to. But if you like the video here today, like and subscribe for more Zelda content in the future. But without any further ado, let's talk about the Legend of Zelda Minish Cap. Zelda games are known for the items you get along the way that make traversing the world and fighting enemies easier and easier. And the Minish Cap has a really good set of items. Let's start with the main weapon of any Zelda game, the sword. Since 2D Zeldas from a top-down perspective, there's not really much opportunity to have in-depth sword combat, but Minish Cap does a pretty good job of it anyway. As you go throughout the world, you discover dojos, places that allow you to learn new techniques for your sword, which makes combat more enjoyable. There are quite a bit of them, so there's a lot of possibilities for how you want to fight enemies in the future. The main gimmick of the sword lets you split into different copies of yourself as you power the sword more and more. On specific tiles, if you do a spin attack, then you can use identical copies of yourself to move different blocks, or attack a certain boss. That gimmick was the center of a lot of the puzzles in the game, where you had to position yourself in a way that would make you be able to go to a certain room, or push a certain box. And I really appreciate it, as for the most part, it was really fun. Outside of the sword, there's a lot of staple items that return, like the bow and arrow and the bombs, and of course they all work fine here, but I really want to focus more on the unique items that don't show up that much in the other games. The first item you get is the Gust Jar, which lets you blow things away. It works on certain enemies as you can blow them in and shoot them out towards the wall, and you can push lily pads across the water when you're in your Minish form. The main feature outside of dungeons and combat is being able to suck in mushrooms to fling Link over large gaps. And for the most part, I like this, it's really fun to do. But in some areas, it's super finicky, as I could be standing directly behind the mushroom, but when I get hit by it, I won't be flung far enough and I'll fall into a pit. But if I try to stand in the corner of the mushroom where I'd be flung over the edge, it just won't hit me at all. It's still pretty well executed for the most part, but definitely not as good as it could have been. The next item I want to talk about is the Cane of Patchy, which lets you flip over certain enemies to make them easier to kill, and lets you get to certain areas that were previously inaccessible by sending out a ball of energy, which lets you flip upwards to that higher platform. It doesn't sound like it would have much purpose outside of the dungeon it comes from, but it kinda does. It allows you to flip over certain Minish Jars in Castletown, which opens up a lot of places. Yeah, you're still not going to use this item outside of very specific situations, but it's still a pretty well utilized item, and definitely not as useless as some other items in different games. The last item I want to talk about is the Mole Mitts, which lets you dig into certain walls around Hyrule. And for the most part, it's pretty good if you want to get some extra rupees, but outside of that, it really doesn't do anything else that I feel the need to bring up. Overall, though, the weapon selection in Minish Cap is very solid and fun to play with. To be honest, I don't have too much to say about the story. With the exception of a few, 2D Zeldas don't really focus on story that much, and mostly want to be more fast-paced adventures. And I appreciate that, as it helps 2D Zeldas stand on their own compared to the more broad 3D Zeldas. That being said, Minish Cap does have a story. It starts out with you and Zelda going to a festival in Castletown, and then her getting frozen by the winner of a tournament named Vati, who turns out to be an evil wizard. He then breaks the Minish Sword and disappears. And your mission for the game is to get the Minish Sword back to its full glory, so you can save Zelda from being a stone statue. Along the journey is a hat named Ezlo that used to be a wizard before being turned into a hat by Vati. And eventually, after you've beaten all the dungeons and gotten the Minish Sword back to its full glory, you can save Zelda and defeat Vati, putting an end to the story. I'm not gonna lie, it's not like it's perfect or anything, it's a very basic story. But then again, it's not trying to be the most in-depth story of all time, so it definitely does the job well. One thing I want to bring up before we move on to the next section though, is there just me, or does Vati kind of remind me of Girahim from Skyward Sword? Like, whenever Vati laughs in Minish Cap, it sounds just like Girahim. Well, maybe it's just me. Anyway, let's move on to the next section, the dungeons. Minish Cap honestly doesn't have that many dungeons. It really only has 6, but really it's not about the quantity, it's about the quality. So, how's the quality? Well, let's run through them all. The first dungeon, Deepwood Shrine, plays with the Minish mechanics quite well. It still feels like a normal dungeon because the whole entire thing is shrunken due to its size. So, the dungeon ends up letting you ride on lily pads with the Gust Jar, and its boss fight is just an enlarged version of a normal enemy, but the enemy is only enlarged because you're permanently in Minish form for this dungeon. So overall, Deepwood Shrine was pretty memorable. The second dungeon, called the Cave of Flame, was fine. It wasn't overly mind-blowing, but I did like the part with the minecart. It was pretty funny to see Link freak out. The third dungeon, the Fortress of Winds, was pretty decent. There was a lot of digging, but it never became obtrusive. But you don't even get one of the medallions after you beat it, so it just kind of feels like, why did I go here in the first place? But on the other hand, there'd be even less dungeons if they removed it, so I'm not mad for it being here. The next dungeon, the Temple of Droplets, is actually one of my favorites, even though it has ice physics. You still have to slip and slide your way around a dungeon, but it has a pretty cool misdirect. Makes you believe you finished it way faster than you did because you hit the boss key so early on. But when you enter the room, the boss is frozen over, so you have to melt it. And that puzzle is a mainstay across the entire dungeon. You have to melt floors to get lower, and you gotta melt ice blocks in order to move on to the next room. It was pretty fun, even with the ice physics. The penultimate dungeon, the Palace of Winds, is also a pretty fun one. You get to fly around the entire dungeon with the Rockscape, and it's pretty cool since you're above the clouds. If I had to say one bad thing about that dungeon though, it was a tad bit long. The final dungeon, surprise surprise, is Dark Hyrule Castle. Even though Hyrule Castle is the final dungeon in a lot of Zelda games, I always quite enjoy them. This one was alright. Definitely wasn't my favorite Hyrule Castle, as there was quite a bit of Darknut fights. Like before you got to the final boss, I swear to God, you would fight like 10 Darknuts. I did like the final boss quite a bit though, as you got to use a lot of the items you got along the adventure, and the fight was just fun in general. And yeah, overall the dungeons of Minish Cap were a pretty good time, although they definitely aren't the best the series has to offer. Now we're at the last section of this review, the world of the Minish Cap. First off, for a Game Boy Advance game that came out in 2004, this game is really pretty. The world is very colorful, and the sprites of the characters are really well done. Now, outside of going to the dungeons, there's several parts about the world I want to talk about. The first thing being one of the key features, Kinstone fusion. Outside of just talking to villagers, you can also fuse Kinstone pieces with them, which will give you some benefits throughout the world. There's also 4 different types of Kinstones, green, red, blue, and yellow, depending on what kind of fusion it is. The green ones are kind of basic ones, the red and blue ones are better ones, and the yellow ones are the one required for the story. And I like the idea of Kinstone fusion, in theory. Most of the time, you'll just get Kinstones randomly from fighting enemies, so it can get grindy if you really want to get all of them. Some of the rewards when I fuse Kinstones are really good, and I really appreciate going out of my way to solve their problems, whereas some felt kind of like a hassle or just not important enough to go get even after I did fuse with them. So although it's a cool addition, it's definitely not implemented in the way I would have wanted it. The next thing I want to talk about is the time between dungeons. Basically the stuff you're required to get before you can go into the next dungeon. And yeah, I really didn't like any of the stuff you had to do. It was pretty grindy. Sometimes you'll have to like grind to get like 50 rupees or something to buy an item to go further into the section, which would require me to leave the area I'm in to go around to Hyrule Field to finally get 50 rupees. I got to go all the way back to buy the item. One time you had to do a side quest that didn't seem important but is required to do if you want to get the specific item, having to get books all around the world to return to the library. A quest that was pretty tedious. The only thing required between dungeons that I liked was before you went to the Palace of Winds, where you got to fly around looking for the yellow Kinstones. Because at least then you didn't have to really grind for anything. I do want to bring up that it did come out in the Game Boy Advance, so the reason they put in the grindy stuff was so you'd spend more time with the game. So I do understand why it's there. The last thing I want to bring up is how cool shrinking down is. Around the world, these are Minish platforms that let you shrink down to the size of a Minish to let you see the world of Hyrule from a new perspective. It was a ton of fun to see, especially in the transition parts where you got to see a full-size Link with a smaller size Hyrule. Shrinking down was definitely my favorite part of Minish Cap, and of course that's what it's known for, so it makes sense. Although there's some parts of exploring Hyrule in the Minish Cap that I don't like, I think it definitely is pretty unique, and its pros definitely outweigh the cons. The Minish Cap, while not my favorite 2D Zelda, was a very fun game to play. About a year ago, I made a video ranking every Zelda that was on the Switch at the time. If I had to place Minish Cap on that list, I'd place it slightly below A Link to the Past. I definitely enjoyed my time with the game a lot. But with that being said, thank you so much for watching my video. It was definitely fun giving my full thoughts on the Zelda game in a more complete format, compared to my last Zelda video where I kinda just summarized my thoughts on each game. But don't worry, my next Zelda video won't be in a year. It will be probably in a couple months once I finish Tears of the Kingdom, as I'm definitely gonna make a video on that game. But with that being said, thank you so much for watching my video, and I'll see you all next time.